At the beginning of the 1st century BC, Rome was at its height as a republic. It had defeated all of its enemies and attested itself as the ruler of the Mediterranean Sea. And yet, the game was not over. Great families and generals wanted glory and power, but without an external foe, they were beginning the turn inward. The long war between the two political parties in Rome, Optimates and Populares, was reaching its apex. But what were these parties? What did they represent? It is very easy for us to see the Populares as the good guys and the Optimates as the bad guys. After all, someone who wants the good of the people should be a good person, right? And yet, to truly understand the Rome at the time, it is necessary to enter their way of thinking. To maintain balance, order, to maintain the traditions of Rome was an important task. We'll see soon in this episode what happens when the rules of the King of the Hill game that is Rome are broken. When the politicians that usually play at the same game start fighting for the top spot. When blood starts flowing in the streets and Rome changes from a republic based on great families and specific political rules to one ruled with an iron fist by great characters that we are going to follow one by one. Today we'll see what happens when Marius and Sulla come to blows, and we introduce the new players of the game, those who are gonna be the protagonists of one of the most interesting moments in Roman history, the one from which the characters we know and love are from: Cicero, Cato, Crassus, Pompey, and of course, Julius Caesar. Let's begin. After having turned his legions against Rome in 88 BC, Sulla was finally gone to fight Mithridates in the east and finally find his own fortune. With Sulla gone, the streets of Rome should have found peace. Instead, they trembled under the blood-soaked grip of Gaius Marius and his ally, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a fiery patrician turned populare, with his own score to settle. Together, Marius and Cinna seized control of Rome after Sulla departed for the war he was chosen to lead as consul. The Senate left by Sulla in power was powerless to resist them, and their first order of business was revenge. The city became a stage for violent purges. Senators, equites, and anyone associated with Sulla was hunted down. The ancient Roman historian Appian describes the bloodbath vividly. Lists of the condemned were posted in the forum, and executioners roamed the city like wolves. Those named had no trial, no defense, only death. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, a prominent aristocrat, tried to flee, but was dragged from his hiding place and executed in the street. Quintus Lutatius Catulus, Marius' former co-consul and distinguished statesman, took his own life rather than face the butcher sent after him. These purges were not just about politics. This was personal. Marius' grudge against the Senate, which had exiled him years earlier, fueled the carnage. The heads of the executed were displayed in the forum, a macabre warning for any who might think of opposing the new regime. Cinna proved himself no less brutal than Marius. He commanded the loyalty of desperate men eager for plunder, promising rewards for loyalty and punishment for hesitation. His soldiers and his bands of criminals turned Rome into a battlefield, their swords cutting down enemies in the name of the Populares cause. Property was confiscated, homes looted, and families destroyed. But as Marius unleashed his vengeance on anyone allied with his rival Sulla, his health faltered. In January 86 BC, he succumbed to illness. Marius, the great consul of Rome, the new man, died, tormented by visions of battles past and of the terror of the return of the Lion of Rome. Despite the iron rule Cinna still had on the city, even without Marius, a spectre haunted him, the inevitable return of Sulla. Even as blood ran through the streets of Rome, whispers carried ominous news from the east. Sulla had vanquished Mithridates and was preparing to return home with a veteran killer army. Fear only made Cinna tighten his grip on the city. He started preparing for the inevitable confrontation and sending troops to fight Sulla or convince him to surrender. We're not going to go into details about these confrontations, and we'll just say that each and every time Sulla found himself in front of a Roman army, he simply convinced the Roman army to join him. But before proceeding, let's talk details. With Marius and Cinna firmly in control of Rome, their regime was not just about bloodletting. It was about reshaping the Republic to secure their vision of power. Behind the executions and terror lay attempts at sweeping reforms, driven by both ideological convictions and the desire to cement their own dominance. Cinna, ever ambitious, sought to break the stranglehold of the conservative Senate, while Marius, embittered by years of exile, wanted to ensure that populares held sway long after his death. Together, they pushed through radical legislation. Let's take a look at some examples. One of their first moves was to overhaul the voting system in Rome. According to the historian Valleius Paterculus, Cinna reintroduced exiled populares and expanded citizenship rights to the newly enfranchised Italians, who had gained most of it through the social war, of which we talked in the last episode. This move swelled the electorate with men loyal to the regime, as the Italians knew the populares had a lot more to gain by having them in the voting pool. The next target was the treasury, drained by constant warfare. Cinna imposed confiscations of property from wealthy senators and equites accused of supporting Sulla. According to Appian, fortunes were seized without trial and entire families were reduced to beggary overnight. Violence accompanied these expropriations. Soldiers loyal to the regime carried out plunder and murder with impunity. Among the most chilling tales is that of Marcus Antonius, a distinguished orator and statesman. According to Plutarch, when the assassins cornered him, Antonius attempted to sway them with his legendary rhetoric. For a moment, they hesitated, entranced by his word, until their commander reminded them their orders. Antonius was slaughtered on the spot. And isn't this just the entire story of this first fall of Rome in a nutshell, as the beautiful words of the great orator fall deaf on the ears of brutes and soldiers? Military command structure was also changed by Cinna, as he appointed personally his men without senatorial approval or following the cursus honorum. All of the reforms made by Cinna and Marius were built on unstable foundations, as they still had to fight the actual rival. But before we go on, let's go into details about what was happening to our future protagonists. Let's start with Marcus Licinius Crassus. His father was targeted, but according to Plutarch, this wasn't enough. Publius, Crassus' father, and one of his other sons were captured and executed after a desperate attempt to flee Rome. Their heads were displayed in the Forum as a grim symbol of populares dominance. Marcus himself barely escaped the carnage. He fled to Spain, where he hid in caves and relied on loyal clients for survival. This experience, living as a fugitive despite his aristocratic background, forged his ruthless pragmatism and obsession with wealth. He would later become the richest man in Rome, seeing money as a shield against political vulnerability. His hatred for the populares and loyalty to Sulla would be lifelong. And what of Gaius Julius Caesar? He was just a teenager when Marius and Cinna seized control. He was the nephew of Marius by marriage. His aunt Julia was Marius' wife. This initially protected him, of course, as Marius and Cinna rewarded their allies. In 84 BC, Caesar married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, further cementing his ties to the Populares factions. However, things were gonna change where Sulla returned. For now, he was living life to the fullest, surrounded by family, friends, and allies. And what of Pompey? He was the son of the powerful general Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo. His father was a controversial figure, reviled by both the Senate and the Populares. Strabo's sudden death in 87 BC, possibly from illness or assassination, left young Pompey in a dangerous political landscape, but at least at the head of his family. Despite his youth, Pompey quickly proved himself resourceful. He managed to maintain his family influence in the region of Picenum, where his father had strong support. When Sulla returned in Italy in 83 BC, as we're about to see, Pompey raised a private army from his family clients and marched to join Sulla. Pompey was lucky to be away from Rome at this time, and he did not face the worst of the Populares' fury. As we said, Marius died in 86 BC. Plutarch describes the aging general as restless and delusional, haunted by memories of battles long won and enemies long dead. Cinna was now alone, paranoid, in the middle of violent purges, executions, and trying to raise new legions to defend Rome. Veterans loyal to the Populares were promised land and wealth for their service, and Cinna ordered to strengthen the fortifications along the Via Appia and the coastal regions, knowing Sulla would likely land in the south. But there was no hiding the cracks in the Populares coalition. Appian notes that divisions emerged among Marius' foremost supporters. Quintus Sertorius, a brilliant but independent-minded general, began to distance himself from Cinna, noting how he was becoming increasingly erratic. Sertorius despised the needless bloodshed and had come to hate his own allies. He quietly prepared for a future that did not include Cinna. Cinna's paranoia reached its zenith when he declared martial law and imposed harsh penalties on those suspected of harboring sympathy for Sulla. He was certain that if Sulla marched on Rome, everyone would desert him, and with this in mind, he attempted to lead an army to confront Sulla and avoid his arrival in Italy. His soldiers, wary of his erratic commands and brutal discipline, finally mutinied. In a fit of rage, they turned on their leader and killed him. Rome was now leaderless, its government teetering on the brink of collapse. The Populares faction, once unified by ambition and vengeance, was now fractured and weak. Sulla's return was now less of a threat and more of a grim inevitability. And then it happened. Sulla had landed at Brundisium, modern-day Brindisi. His legions, disciplined and eager for blood, began their march northward towards Rome. Waiting for him was a young and ambitious Gnaeus Pompeius, as we said. He was already commanding his own private army. When Sulla disembarked, Pompey greeted him not as a wary ally, but as a devoted subordinate, leading a sizable army. To Sulla, an experienced judge of character, Pompey was an open book. He immediately understood the absolute need for praise and recognition that burned in the heart of the young man. So instead of taking him in as the youngster he was, and as the secondary ally he probably should have been, he clasped hands with Pompey. Smiling, he hailed Pompey as Magnus, the Great, and gave him exactly what his heart desired. Such was the ability of Sulla to manipulate and understand people. He had already turned multiple armies against their leaders and was now working his magic in the future of Roman politics. By 82 BC, Rome laid before Sulla. The weak Populares defenses burned down, destroyed, or just vanquished. The city was taking a sigh of relief from the paranoia of Cinna and now had to face the vengeance of Sulla. As one of his first acts, Sulla proclaimed himself Dictator Rei Publicae Constituenda Causa, dictator for the reconstruction of the Republic. This was no mere consulship. It was a title laden with extraordinary powers, with precedents rarely invoked. Unlike previous dictators who held power temporarily to resolve a crisis, Sulla's dictatorship had no fixed term, no end to it. Absolute power, potentially forever. First of all, Sulla dismissed magistrates loyal to Marius and Cinna, and reconstructed the Senate, swelling its number from around 300 to 600 by appointing loyal equites and provincial elites, gathering allies that he really needed. His goal was clear: rebuild the Senate as the dominant force in Roman politics, eclipsing the populist assemblies that had thrived under Marius. And, well, he was willing to accept the reality that he needed to go against some tradition to do so, and introduce provincial power to the formerly city-state-sized Senate. Following this act, Sulla acted against the tribunes. The tribunate, once a powerful tool for popular reform, was gutted. Tribunes were stripped of their right to propose legislation directly to the assemblies, effectively neutering their role as champions of the people. Sulla's disdain for the office was clear. He sought to ensure no future populist uprising would use it against the Senate. Then came the judicial reforms. Control over the courts was transferred firmly to the Senate. Sulla created the Questiones Perpetue, standing courts, to handle cases of corruption, extortion, and treason, placing these vital judicial functions under aristocratic control and taking them away from the equites class. Then Sulla sought to curb the ambitions of the provincial governors. This was a direct response to the rise of figures like Marius and his own bitter experiences with the abuse of provincial power. These new rules, mainly, would avoid provincial governors declaring war for Rome, centralizing the administration of foreign affairs in the hands of the Senate. Beyond political restructuring, Sulla embarked on a campaign to reward his loyalists. Land confiscated from defeated populares was distributed to his veterans, creating colonies throughout Italy. This move not only rewarded service, but also ensured a loyal base of settlers who would bolster his influence in the countryside. Yet, Sulla's reforms were not without hurdles. Resistance simmered among the remnants of the populares, including prominent figures like Quintus Sertorius, who fled to Spain and continued to defy Sulla authority for years. Even within the Senate, there were those who resented his heavy-handed rule, though they dared not speak openly. We'll meet Sertorius later, as he will create a new Rome in Spain with his own Senate, and clash swords with the greats of his age. Sulla had tried to turn back the clock to an earlier, more aristocratic republic, but it felt like a denial of the political realities that had emerged during the turbulent social war and the populares' ascendancy. People in Rome knew things were gonna change soon, and it wasn't gonna be painless. And now we get to Sulla's vengeance. As he tightened his grip on the Republic, he unleashed terror across the city. He did it through the creation of the proscription lists. The proscriptions officially began in late 82 BC. They listed condemned men and were posted in the middle of the forum. Their name was etched into doom. The consequences of being on a list were immediate and brutal. Anyone on the list was declared an enemy of the state, their property was confiscated, and their lives forfeit. Rewards were offered to informants and assassins, 2 talents of silver for every head delivered. Some would reach the forum in the morning, find their own name on the list, and be dead before they came out of the forum. The historian Appian recounts that the violence spread like wildfire through Italy, with entire towns succumbing to a feverish hysteria. The bodies of the condemned littered the streets, abandoned to scavengers. Their blood stained the sacred stones of Rome. No sanctuary was safe, not even temples and the homes of friends. Some chose to find their own end. One remarkable tale involves Quintus Lutatius Catullus, a distinguished politician and former consul. Sulla's agent stormed his house, intent on claiming his life. Facing certain death, Catullus chose a Roman final act of defiance. He locked himself in a room and inhaled the fumes from a burning brazier, taking his own life before his enemies could lay a hand on him. The greed that fueled the proscriptions was staggering. Properties of the condemned were confiscated and auctioned off at absurdly low prices. Friends of Sulla grew fabulously wealthy overnight, buying up entire estates for a fraction of their worth. Marcus Licinius Crassus, while enjoying vengeance for his brother and father, was one of those who gained more from this. Plutarch describes how Crassus acquired vast lands by exploiting the chaos, often intimidating other bidders or manipulating the auctions to his advantage. Yet, it was not only political enemies who suffered. Personal vendettas flourished under the cover of state-sanctioned murder. Some were killed by their beautiful mansion, others by their green garden. If you owned something someone else wanted, a whisper in the right ear could put you on a list. A man named Quintus Aurelius, a mild-mannered equus with no political affiliation, had the misfortune of owning a particularly desirable villa outside of Rome. A rival coveted the property and bribed officials to place Aurelius' name on the proscription list. When Aurelius returned to Rome, unaware of his newfound status as a condemned man, he strolled through the forum only to be recognized by a soldier. Appian tells us that Aurelius, confused and disbelieving, was summarily executed on the spot. The psychological toll of all of this terror on the city was profound. Friends and families of the proscribed lived in perpetual fear, unsure who might betray them next. The rewards for informing were too tempting for many to resist. Even slaves turned against their masters, hoping for freedom and financial gain. Plutarch notes that some assassins grew so emboldened by their impunity that they killed indiscriminately, targeting anyone who appeared wealthy or influential. After all, their name just needed to appear on a list, even posthumously. When the proscriptions began, Julius Caesar was 18 years old. His ties to the populares through his marriage to Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, made him a prime target. Sulla personally demanded that Caesar divorce Cornelia, hoping to sever his connection to the defeated faction. He didn't just execute the young Caesar, both because he was just a boy and because he was from an ancient and prominent family, something Sulla and his aristocrat Optimates respected. Many influential friends and relatives spoke in favor of Caesar when he refused to divorce his wife. Among them was his mother Aurelia and even the Vestal Virgins, an extremely important order of priestesses who tended to the eternal flame of Rome. Sulla eventually relented and reportedly said, "Spare him, fools, but in that boy I see many a Marius." Sulla had already spotted Caesar's potential, but he did understand it would only come into play after his reign was concluded. Though spared, Caesar fled Rome. He spent years in the East honing his military skills and building alliances that would serve him well in the future. The experience taught Caesar a lesson. He learned firsthand the dangers of political purges and the importance of unwavering loyalty. Pompey, at the same time, was having the time of his life. He was one of the captains who had won the war for Sulla, and now he was granted the hand of Emilia, Sulla's stepdaughter. Despite her already being married and pregnant, Pompey didn't care. It was just another step on the road to power and especially glory and admiration. Crassus, on the other hand, was becoming absurdly rich and even led military campaigns for Sulla, crushing the Marian forces in Umbria during the war. His battlefield successes and cunning financial maneuvering made him indispensable to Sulla's regime. Finally, after reshaping Rome with terror and reform, Sulla did something extraordinary. He walked away. In 79 BC, the man who had wielded absolute power and painted the Republic red with blood voluntarily resigned as dictator. Plutarch captures the astonishment of the people. It was as though a wild beast had suddenly laid down its fangs. Sulla's abdication was unprecedented and remains one of history's most unexpected moments. Sulla retired to his luxurious villa in Puteoli, near the Bay of Naples, surrounded by opulence and decadence. He indulged in lavish banquets, entertained artists as scholars, and wrote his memoirs, which Plutarch notes were filled with arrogance and self-justification. Though retired, Sulla never abandoned the persona of a godlike figure who had bent Rome to his will. He claimed divine favor from Venus and openly bragged that no man had ever surpassed him in either punishing enemies or rewarding friends. Yet, Sulla's health deteriorated rapidly. His hard living, he was after all a heavy drinker and loved debauchery, took a toll on his body. Both Plutarch and Appian describe a particularly gruesome affliction. His flesh rotted while he was still alive, covered in ulcers and parasites. The stench became so unbearable that even his servants could hardly bear to approach him. Of course, in considering this historical interpretation, we have to think about what Plutarch and Appian thought of the character. Considering how much they hated him, it is very possible this is just a figment of their imagination, just them having the last laugh on the lion that destroyed or maybe saved Rome. It depends who you ask. As death loomed, Sulla remained defiant. His memoirs, written in his last days, contained chilling reflections on his reign and an ominous warning about Julius Caesar. "Beware of that boy," he reportedly told his followers. Sulla died in 78 BC and left a Roman Republic still fractured. The seeds of future conflict had already been planted. Pompey and Crassus, his proteges, would rise to dominate Roman politics in the coming years, though their ambitions would eventually set them against each other. Pompey, who had earned Sulla's favor by ruthlessly purging enemies and securing vital territories, would go on to be hailed as Magnus the Great, not only because Sulla said it, but because of what he did. He'll get his own video, of course. Crassus kept gaining wealth and becoming more and more influential, and as for Caesar, spared by Sulla's reluctant mercy, he would bide his time, learning from the mistakes and triumphs of men like Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, Marius, Cinna. His destiny was already unfolding, and the echoes of Sulla's reign would resound through Caesar's rise, the fall of the Republic, and the birth of an empire. Carved on Sulla's tomb at the Campus Martius are the words, "No friend ever did me kindness, nor enemy a wrong, without being fully repaid."